Hello, everyone. Suddenly, I have a mask on. Yes, it is still COVID. Thank you all for, thank you, Maxor, for that first talk. It was a delight meeting you. Thank you all for tuning in tonight, and I hope that you have gotten some refreshments and are ready for round 2 of the global challenge of religious freedom. Before we begin, I have a few things to say. We want people to go to our YouTube site. Go to YouTube, type in Carolina Public Humanities, and if you have a YouTube account, please follow us. We're going to be loading that site up with more and more content, and we're very, very pleased with what we have on there now. A lot of our lunch with friends and strangers, a lot of our special events that we do for K-12. You can have an opportunity to see scholars that we might not often have in our public programming. So please go to YouTube, follow us, and so you can get a hold of some of that great content that we have. Again, some of which is not available for the public until it shows up on YouTube. We also want you to follow us on Facebook, as well as go to humanities.unc.edu and check out our programs. Quickly, I want to just mention that we have Margaret Foster next week coming for Humanities in Action, and she'll be giving a very different talk than we've had so far in the series, looking at gig economies and their relationship to radical movements. And that is something that absolutely intrigues me because I don't know where that talk is going to go, so I'm going to be there to find out, and I hope you will as well. When I say there, I mean here. But I don't want to take any more time of our next speaker's time. I'm going to give a very brief introduction, and she will introduce herself to you as well. Our next speaker is Ariane Akinci. She is a PhD candidate in the history department, a member of the Royster Society of Fellows. Those are Carolina's best graduate students, and we are absolutely, we're psyched that we could find someone to talk about this. We've been hearing about it in the news. We don't know the experts on this, and we have a lot to be exposed to and to think about when we look at China as a defender of the faith, power, rhetoric, Islam, and Uyghur rights in the People's Republic of China. It is a great delight to welcome, for the first time to the Carolina Public Humanities stage, Ariane Akinci. Take it away.
Thank you for having me here this evening. Even though I am talking about China, and particularly the far west of China, there are actually a lot of themes in my talk that really resonate with what you just heard from Max. So, good evening, welcome, thank you for having me, and thank you to Professor Max Auray for a great first presentation that I can kind of piggyback off of. Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself a little bit. My name is Ariane Akinci, and I am a PhD candidate in the History Department at UNC Chapel Hill, focusing on incorporation of religious minorities, particularly the Turkish Muslim Uyghurs of Xinjiang, or of East Turkestan, into the Chinese nation, and the experiences of the Uyghurs in diaspora and advocating for recognition as an ethno-political community. Prior to commencing my PhD at UNC, I studied Chinese and history at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and then I spent 4 years in different parts of China studying Chinese and working in education and development, and then I spent several more years in Central Asia and Turkey working in development and a policy-oriented think tank. In 2013, the year that interethnic relations began to deteriorate in Xinjiang, and the year before the now infamous re-education centers were constructed by the Chinese state, I was living in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, and teaching at a state university, as well as studying Uyghur there. My presentation today is founded on my academic research, but framed by my personal experience and in-person interviews that I conducted in Xinjiang in 2012 and 2013. While I currently focus more on the Uyghur diaspora because it's impossible to conduct research in the PRC, particularly in Xinjiang at this time period, I did write my master's thesis at UNC on the intended incorporation of the Uyghur women into the Chinese nation in the early decades of the People's Republic of China. Today I will be talking about the Chinese state and its use of Islam in framing state policy in Xinjiang, the northwesternmost province that is historically and geographically part of Central Asia, home to 10 million plus Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Right. Now, before we dive into the subject at hand, I would like to introduce a framework for thinking about official rhetoric and religious freedom, and hopefully I can get the clicker to work. Great. Okay. One of my favorite in-class activities is to have students do Cold War Valentines. Each group of students is assigned a primary document, a letter written from one Cold War leader to another or about another, and they have to turn that primary document into a Valentine's Day card. This is not, it's very humorous as an instructor and as a grader, but it's not entirely as simple as it sounds. To write a convincing Valentine's card, they need to figure out the current relations between the two individuals, what each desires, what each has to offer, what each fears, and how one party can convince the other to deliver what they need without exposing their own anxieties and weaknesses. As students usually realize halfway through this exercise, we know what leaders say, but do we know what they really mean? What are the intentions and implications of their words? What are they leading? Where are they leading their audiences? What narrative are they creating for them? And what does this narrative obscure? What are the hidden implications of these narratives, the undersides we are not meant to see? Today, I will be looking at how leaders in China, specifically Zhou Enlai in the 1950s, Wang Lichuan in the 1990s and early 2000s, and most recently Xi Jinping, have latched onto international rhetoric concerning religion, particularly Islam, to craft narratives that support increased state intervention into borderland regions and active remodeling of ethnic minority nationals. As I mentioned above, the talk today will focus on Uyghur Muslims in China. China is a country of over 1 billion people. Approximately 20 million or more of these peoples are Muslim, with half of these being Chinese-speaking Muslims known as the Hui or Dungan, which we will not talk about today, and half being Uyghur or other Turkic and Persian ethnicities. Officially, there are 12 million Uyghur in China, but this figure is open to dispute. Many Uyghur leaders claim that due to underreporting and under-registration in rural areas, the true figure may be much higher. Uyghurs predominantly reside in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which you can see on this map here. Xinjiang is politically in the far northwest of China and geographically and culturally part of Central Asia. Going by contemporary political borders, Xinjiang is 4 times the size of California, the source of both natural gas and numerous rare earth minerals necessary for China's high-tech industry, currently produces 1/4 of the world's tomatoes, including all of your Heinz ketchup, or most of it, and 20% of the world's cotton supplies. It serves as a population valve for overcrowded inner China and borders 8 countries, several of which China has sensitive relations with. Suffice it to say, Xinjiang is a strategic holding. Right. Xinjiang was not always recognized as a part of China, and the government, and the government of the People's Republic of China has worked tirelessly from the 1950s on to convince the rest of the world that it is indeed the legitimate government of this region that geoculturally looks very little like inner China. In the talk today, I look at how the PRC, under the government of the decidedly atheist Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, intended to incorporate Uyghurs and other Muslims on the fringes of the new nation into the People's Republic of China in the foundational years of the state. 2, created a strategy to justify its claim over Muslim-majority regions and pitch itself as the legitimate government of Muslim peoples on the international stage, particularly among Muslim-majority nations at the Asian African Conference at Bandung in 1955. 3rd, avoided secession of the region after the fall of the USSR in 1991, led to independence of Turkic Muslim states across Central Asia. 4th, appropriated the diction of the War on Terror following the 9/11 attacks to justify more direct government involvement in Xinjiang. And finally, subsequently intensified security in Xinjiang and developed internment camps from 2014 to present, while still claiming to patronize ethnic culture and religious freedom. In the first half of the 20th century, China was not a single unified nation-state. Even within Xinjiang, Russian, then Soviet, British, Chinese nationalist, Chinese communist, Chinese Muslim, and local Turkey groups contended for power. Most of inner China experienced decades of civil war between the Chinese nationalists, who later fled to Taiwan, Chinese communists, various local warlords, and the Japanese, who were actively trying to establish an East Asian empire. Not until the very late 1940s was it certain, or even likely, that China would ever come into being as a single nation-state, or that the Chinese Communist Party would become the head of this state. Within Xinjiang, there was no unified consensus on what a future state should look like. Chinese nationalist strongmen attempted to rule from the regional capital of Urumqi. An independent Turkic Muslim state, the First East Turkestan Republic, briefly existed in the 1930s. The Soviets backed an independent multi-ethnic secular state in the north in the 1940s, the Second East Turkestan Republic. And from 1946 on, nationalist-affiliated Turks from the south attempted to form a coalition government with the state in the north. You do not need to remember all of this. All you need to know is that there was no singular vision for Xinjiang, and Xinjiang was not a singular polity in this period. So during this period, there were instances, many of them, of Muslims in China collaborating with Chinese-led governments. Both leaders of the movement for East Turkestani sovereignty, including the father of the founder of the World Uyghur Congress, had worked with and within the Chinese nationalist government with the belief that the Chinese nationalists would eventually allow them greater regional autonomy. By the late 1940s, many of these leaders were disillusioned with the nationalists' failure to fulfill these promises and pushy strongman politics. So the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, which was founded in 1921 and grew over the following decades, promised a break from the strongman politics and warlordism of the first half of the 20th century. Like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CCP offered universalism and representation of the working class rather than a particular ethnic or linguistic group. The party was both atheist and supposedly super-ethnic. Nevertheless, it's impossible to ignore that the early CCP was comprised primarily of ethnic Han Chinese, used Chinese as its language of internal communication, settled in the old imperial capital of Beijing, and claimed it was contributing to the development of 5,000 years of Chinese history. From early on, the CCP viewed itself as the enlightened elder brother, awakening the Chinese peasantry to political enlightenment, doling out rights, and protecting the interests of the colorful minorities. When the CCP finally won the Civil War and established the People's Republic of China in 1949, the new state claimed a population that was predominantly Han Chinese, broadly speaking, and nominally Taoist or Buddhist, but it claimed a territory that was predominantly inhabited by non-Chinese speaking Muslims and ardent Buddhists. So this is an ethno-linguistic map from 1956. As you can see, the Han Chinese, the kind of mustard, it's more of like a ugly green-yellow color, is really just in the east and the north. Within this, there is still great ethno-linguistic diversity, but as you can see, at least half of the country, it's actually closer to 60%, is territory inhabited by ethnic minorities. So, if the new state was going to establish internal governance and convince other nations that it was both a legitimate state within the borders it claimed and the legitimate government of this vast and varied population, it needed to appear representative of its new nationals. This created a bit of a PR problem for an adamantly secular socialist state ruled by an atheist communist party. How can an atheist ruling party claim to represent a majority Muslim population, as in Xinjiang? So how did the PRC intend to incorporate Muslim minorities from the fringes of the new nation, and how did the state pitch itself as a legitimate government of its Muslim minorities to majority Muslims? Okay. Popular literature, newspaper and magazine articles widely read throughout the country demonstrate how the state envisioned their role in the Muslim borderlands and the relationship between state, Han Chinese, and Muslim minorities. Many stories that appear in the popular press at this time depict young Uyghur women as oppressed and without opportunity, barred from beyond the threshold, and subject to the cruelty of local landlords and corrupt religious leaders before the arrival of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Following the incorporation of Xinjiang into the PRC, this woman is invariably offered a role in society, as a performer in the public cultural group, as a party cadre, as a factory worker, as a participant in the neighborhood political committee, and with that support and guidance from the party, she becomes a productive and happy member of society. Oftentimes, this support comes in the guise of Han elder brothers, which is a weird term. It's used even when all of the participants are female, as in this picture here. So Han elder brothers, sometimes even 16-year-olds from Shanghai, come to Urumqi to teach Uyghur women who have worked in sericulture for millennia how to spin and weave silk on the new machines. The performance troupe leader who sits everyone down to read Chairman Mao's speech on the role of arts in revolution. This early PRC literature concerning Uyghurs demonstrates that liberation was not simply bestowed upon them. Access to political and economic rights was contingent on rendering oneself visible by stepping into state-defined spaces of production or political participation, and acceptance of external tutelage from elder brother ethnicities while engaged in labor for the nation. This perpetuated dependence of Uyghurs on the Chinese state served to justify Chinese state-led intervention and development in Xinjiang. While women in inner China faced many of the same restrictions before and sometimes after the establishment of the PRC, texts focused on Xinjiang present the liberation of Uyghur women as something local and particular. Women are liberated from Uyghur society, particularly Uyghur men, and existing oppressive institutions of Islam. Essentially, China is pinkwashing the incorporation of Xinjiang. The same publications demonstrate that the state sought to liberate feminized local Islamic customs, religious practice, from masculinized Islamic institutions. Mirroring the conditional liberation of Uyghur women, the state offered support for Islamic practices, provided they occurred within officially prescribed arenas. Popular publications portray religious institutions and religious practice in Xinjiang in two different lights. Religious institutions are likened with feudalism as unproductive and exploitative, and therefore something that needs to be taken under the supervision of the impartial and universal Chinese state. Religious practice, on the other hand, was not treated as a category separate from, and indeed was assumed to reside within, ethnicity and local cultures and customs. While the legal status of religious institutions and educators is interpreted within the secular framework governing institutions and educators generally, laws covering freedom of religious expression primarily address freedom of cultural expression. In Xinjiang, Islam is portrayed not as a broad system of beliefs through which communities interpret all aspects of society and individual life, but as a set of practices particular to different ethnic groups, near synonymous with folk culture. As one publication states directly following a paragraph on religious freedom, the state gives equal weight to minorities' ancestral customs and respects people of all ethnic groups. Every ethnic group has the freedom to preserve or reform its local customs. While the Constitution guarantees individual rights to religious freedom and practice, the surrounding discussion makes clear that this is a right to local variance, not a right to engage in systems that could challenge the state. In writing about religion in Xinjiang, the state evidenced little interest in the socially informative side of Islam, preferring instead to see the practices of Uyghur Islam, like all other religions in the PRC, as a discrete embodiment of local custom, compatible but not competing with the universal system of Chinese socialism. By locating religious practice within local custom, and thus within a delineated sphere of activity, the PRC attempted to strip it of any potential to regulate individual lives, structure society, or determine political and economic affairs. Notably, the institutions of Islam that the state patronized were aligned with Orthodox Sunni Islam as practiced by the Chinese-speaking Muslims that comprise just under half of China's Muslim population. Islam is practiced in Xinjiang by the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and others, has long been imbued with folk practices with elements of mysticism, and two branches of a large Central Asian Sufi network had historically wielded both political and spiritual influence over the region. Yet the new leaders of the China Islamic Association were predominantly Chinese Muslim adherents of Orthodox Sunni Islam, with the one member from Xinjiang, Burhan Shahidi, being a noted secularist. So while there was freedom of religion in China, religious practice was seen as an aspect of particular local culture, and religious institutions and doctrine were standardized to exclude regional or cultural variance, or any basis for a distinct ethno-religious identity. Regardless of how well the early PRC justified their rule over majority Muslim borderlands such as Xinjiang to a captive audience at home, they still faced a very real crisis of legitimacy on the international front. Despite rhetoric, rule on the frontier was still shaky. Officials reported on Uyghur separatism and local revolts in Xinjiang through 1958, which is almost an entire decade after the PRC was formed. The Chinese Nationalist Party, which had ruled parts of China from 1911 to 1949 and was now based in Taiwan, still claimed to be the legitimate government of all China, and its claims were recognized by the bulk of the international community. Historically, the Chinese nationalists had much closer relations with Muslim Chinese, including those from Xinjiang, and therefore a perhaps stronger case for claiming rightful sovereignty over the region. The Chinese nationalists had also funded delegations of Chinese Muslims, including people from Xinjiang, to travel throughout Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa in the 1930s, and were therefore the face of Chinese Muslims that many foreign leaders were most familiar with. One of the PRC's first forays onto the international stage was the Asian African Conference held in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, commonly known as the Bandung Conference. Not only was the conference one of China's first major appearances on the international stage, it was also the country's chance to secure international recognition as the legitimate government rightfully representing all the peoples it claimed as Chinese nationals. And to do this, Chinese premier and delegation head Zhou Enlai needed to justify the state's rule of Muslim-majority regions. Zhou also understood that China could use its Muslim population to create a commonality with the participating nations present at Bandung, 14 of which were predominantly Muslim. Zhou used a two-pronged approach, emphasizing peace and collaboration and using token Muslim member of the Chinese delegation and renowned Islamic scholar Da Pusheng to create common ground between China and Muslim-majority states. At Bandung, Zhou repeatedly stressed not communist ideology, but common ground, including through Islam via China's Muslim populations. While this may seem an odd tactic for an avowedly atheist leader, his claims were backed up by the presence of Da, who liberally handed out Chinese translations of the Quran and trilingual picture books detailing the good lives of Muslims in New China. At Bandung, the Chinese state leveraged its Muslim minority populations and state support of Islamic cultural practices and new Islamic institutions to further its interests via inter-Asian diplomacy. Instead of delivering the formal speech he had prepared, Zhou had it distributed as a written statement and delivered an extemporaneous speech stressing unity via common ground. He asked, "Is there any basis for seeking common ground among us?" Yes, there is. The overwhelming majority of the Asian and African countries and people have suffered and are still suffering from the calamities of colonialism. This is acknowledged by all of us. If we seek common ground in doing away with the sufferings and calamities under colonialism, it'll be very easy for us to have mutual understanding and respect, mutual sympathy and support instead of mutual suspicion and fear, mutual exclusion and antagonism. Zhou went on to stress popular support for the communist government and the will of the Chinese people to liberate their own territory. While the government system may be based on a different ideology, he said, the 600 million Chinese people have chosen a political system which is socialist in nature and led by the Chinese Communist Party. Both socialist and non-socialist newly independent states have far more in common, he stressed. It is not ideology that divides them, but experience with imperialism that unites them. Zhou's speech, as you can see in this picture here, was very popular. Bandung was his first foray into international diplomacy, and yet he emerged as one of the preeminent leaders at the meeting. One of the very clever aspects of Zhou's speech was to cast the Chinese Communist Party as the natural and representative government of China, and the US-backed nationalists now in Taiwan as a colonizing state, and to cast religious freedom as encompassing tolerance of atheism. Rather than the CCP colonizing Xinjiang, as anti-communists at the conference had claimed, Zhou claims that they had in fact liberated Xinjiang from the nationalists and offered them religious freedom. In making this shift, Zhou forged commonality with his audience on two bases: experience as a state newly independent after long oppression, and as a government representative and supportive of a large Muslim population. Zhou's second main point, one of 3 points in his speech, was dedicated to the question of religious freedom. He noted freedom of religious belief is a principle recognized by all modern nations. We communists are atheists, but we respect all those who have religious belief. China is a country where there is freedom of religious belief. There are in China not only 7 million communists, but also tens of millions of Muslims. Here in the Chinese delegation, there is a pious imam of the Islamic faith. Such a situation is no obstacle to the internal unity of China. Why should it be impossible in the community of Asian and African countries to unite those with religious belief and those without? The imam in question is none other than Da Pusheng. The 81-year-old deputy director of the China Islamic Association had been selected as Zhou's religious affairs advisor in part for his staunch belief in Chinese nationhood, his familiarity with a number of delegates present at the conference, and his fame as one of the 4 great imams responsible for modernizing and Arabizing Chinese Islam. Da's role was to back Zhou's claims by serving as the embodiment of the complementary natures of communism, Chinese nationalism, and Islam. I need a little bit more water. Before embarking on the trip to Bandung, the delegation had commissioned a number of print materials to bring with them. One of these booklets was Muslims in China, album of separate pictures in English, French, and Indonesian. This booklet underlined the core themes of a united China under the CCP, strong Chinese nationalist identity among Muslims in China, Muslim support for, indeed self-election of and endorsement of a socialist form of government, CCP support for Islamic institutions, including Islamic schools of Islamic learning, and freedom of religious practice, which, as we've already noted, was interpreted within the PRC as freedom for cultural variance, as long as it didn't contradict or undermine the state. Nonetheless, the message is clear. Muslims in China are indeed Chinese Muslims. They are well integrated into the nation and they endorse the new government. Zhou's efforts paid off. He flew back to Beijing, having secured the respect of other delegates at the conference, many of whom would, in the coming years, convince their governments to recognize the PRC as a legitimate government of all China. But Zhou's Muslim card also proved remarkably efficient, especially with Egypt and Saudi Arabia. An Egyptian religious delegation to China in 1955 was followed by a trade delegation and formal recognition in 1956. Da Pusheng secured the right for Chinese Muslims to obtain Hajj visas, and the highly publicized Chinese Hajj delegation of 1956, headed by Da, and their reception by the King of Saudi Arabia served as a symbolic stamp of approval, encouraging the development or strengthening of bilateral relations with a number of new Arab and African nations. This, of course, isn't the only time that China has used its Muslim minorities to forge common ground with other countries and gain entrance into international forum, as we'll see again in a moment. In the meantime, campaign time and the Cultural Revolution majorly shook up society and culture across China. During the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 1976, religion was attacked along with other 4 olds: old ideas, old culture, old habits, and old customs, but not singled out. During this decade, aspects of society determined feudal, backwards, or anti-revolutionary were publicly attacked across China. Antique furniture and Western garb were burned in Shanghai. Peking opera singers were publicly shamed in Beijing. Both translated and traditional literary works were burned. Tombs were desecrated and covered in graffiti in Wusu in Xinjiang, as were Buddhist temples across the country, as you see here in the bottom picture. Many of the Red Guards, or revolutionary youth, aligned with Mao Zedong, undertaking these campaigns in Xinjiang were in fact Uyghur youth, attacking what they viewed as less progressive or reactionary and oppressive aspects of Uyghur society. The top picture is actually a group of Uyghur Red Guards who had traveled all of the way from Xinjiang to Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1966. Islamic scholars, Islamic institutions, and Islamic thought did come under attack during this period, but again, this must be assessed within context, and within context, it did not actually indicate a state-led attack on either Muslims or Islam. In 1976, Mao Zedong died and the Cultural Revolution ended. 2 years later, new Premier Deng Xiaoping ushered in an era of reform and opening. While his main focus was economic reform, this was supported by relaxations in the cultural and societal spheres domestically. Schools were reopened and minorities, including the Uyghur, were allowed and encouraged once again to obtain instruction in their mother tongue. Cultural activities like meshrep gatherings that are pictured here on your left were revived. In 1985, Xinjiang's borders were opened once again, and Uyghur students and entrepreneurs alike moved abroad to pursue educational and economic opportunities. Many of these individuals moved to Turkey, where they found a pre-existing community of East Turkestani refugees who had fled Xinjiang in 1949. While the East Turkestanis had failed to gain international support for an independent state of East Turkestan, despite decades of advocacy, they often passed on their anti-communist ideology and strong sense of Turkic Muslim ethno-political identity to the visiting Uyghurs. Many of today's Uyghur historians, linguists, literary experts, and leaders of the international community actually emerged out of the first or second wave of Uyghur students from Xinjiang to study in Turkey in the 1980s and 1990s. By the late 1980s, these young scholars were bringing ideas of greater East Turkestani independence back to Xinjiang. East Turkestan as a political idea had largely developed in diaspora, and the notion entered Xinjiang just as China was entering a phase of domestic and international turmoil. The late 1980s saw renewed calls for independence or greater autonomy across the country. Just as more educated Uyghurs were going to Beijing or abroad for further education, protests for greater democratization of the country, the Beijing Spring movement, followed by marches on Tiananmen Square, were rocking the capital in 1989. Sometimes the two lines converged. War Kaishi, or Orkesh Dolut, one of the leaders of the Beijing Spring protests and present at the Tiananmen Square incident, was actually a Uyghur student studying at Beijing Normal University. And of course, this happened just months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there are revolutions happening across the world. So as many of you know, however, while Berlin's Wall did fall, China's leaders were not ready to accompany economic freedoms with greater political freedoms. And the Beijing Spring movement culminated in the Tiananmen Square massacre, and calls for greater political freedom within the country for people of all ethnicities and religions were brutally suppressed. Just 2 years later, however, in 1991, the Soviet Union fell, and three newly independent Muslim-majority states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, appeared on Xinjiang's borders, with several more Turkic Muslim states, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan, created further afield. Given that the Soviet Union had been China's model for a secular socialist state incorporating ethnically diverse Muslim-majority lands, and that these lands had now become independent states, some in Xinjiang also began advocating for Xinjiang, which was still majority Uyghur, to become an independent state as well. In the early and mid-1990s, the Turkish government, with the aid from East Turkestani leaders, began a program of pan-Turkic advocacy for creation of a union between Turkey and the newly independent Turkic states of Central Asia. So I guess small digression. So when I was living in Central Asia, I was actually in Kyrgyzstan, and I was living in a Turkish university that had been funded in 1995 by the Turkish government during this pan-Asian push. So this was very present right on China's borders, right on Xinjiang's borders in the mid-1990s. So instead of granting greater autonomy to Xinjiang, however, in 1994, the year before the university in Kyrgyzstan was founded, the Central Committee sent in Wang Liquan. Known as the Stability Secretary, Wang Liquan cracked down on protests and riots with an iron fist. On February 5th of 1997, non-violent Uyghur demonstrations in northern Xinjiang protesting the execution of 30 independence activists and the ban on meshrep gatherings. And I'll go back for a second. So meshrep gatherings are the column over here. So meshrep, they combine song and poetry and dance. They were met with brutal police response. Officials claim that the crackdown on the protests resulted in 9 deaths. Local witnesses suggest between 80 or over 100. Up to 1,600 people were arrested in the ensuing witch hunt for Uyghur separatists or splitists. Many were tortured under arrest. Between installment in 1994 and his forced retirement in 2012, Wang Liquan curtailed Uyghur cultural expressions while simultaneously ignoring and even fanning the flames of inter-ethnic disharmony. Older Han and Uyghur residents, including at the university that I was teaching at, recall growing up next door to one another, playing in the streets with children of various ethnicities and learning each other's languages from everyday interactions. Han and Uyghur locals alike credited Wang Lichuan with worsening inter-ethnic relations and driving a wedge of distrust between Uyghurs, increasingly associated with Islamic terrorism, and Han Chinese, increasingly seen as affiliated with an authoritarian state. Wang Lichuan did not immediately affiliate Uyghur activism with religious terrorism. In the 1990s, Wang Lichuan characterized Uyghur activists within Xinjiang as separatists, and activities challenging or undermining rule by the central state as splitism. The spark that caused the protest in Gulja in 1997 was the outlawing of meshrep, or these Uyghur cultural gatherings with poetry, music, dance, conversation, and sometimes some religious elements. Meshrep is now listed as a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage. The meshrep in northern Xinjiang, where Gulja is located, were not known to be particularly religious. The evenings were often accompanied by alcohol consumption. And it wasn't the possible religious connection that Wang was concerned with when he outlawed the gatherings. It was the potential of these gatherings to concentrate and direct anti-state sentiment, and the celebration of Uyghur culture with pan-Turkic overtones, and that was outside of state-controlled structures. While Islam was not targeted by the state in the 90s, religious practice was nevertheless curtailed. As I discussed in the first part of this talk, religion was put under the provenance of two spheres: local ethnic culture and infrastructure under state jurisdiction. Through the 90s, official institutions of Islam and other religions in Xinjiang were administered through government channels. Imams, religious leaders, for example, were educated in government schools, stressing orthodox interpretations of Islam. Islamic practice, however, clothing, music, dance, pilgrimages to holy sites, festivals, ceremonies, was seen as within the sphere of Uyghur culture. And because the state was wary of nationalistic expressions of distinct ethnic culture and worried about pan-Turkic associations with Uyghur culture, the state started to concern itself with the everyday expressions and practices of Islam, such as seen in the meshrep. Scholars of religion in Xinjiang see a shift in the 90s from control of religious professionals via state administration to closer concern with the religious practices of everyday citizens. Nevertheless, the focus was not on religion, not yet. Through the 1990s, Wang Lichuan used the vocabulary of ethnic splitism to describe Uyghur activism and non-state sanctioned activities. Unfortunately for the Chinese state, due to the recent independence of Turkic states across the former Soviet Union, ethnic separatism had some international resonance. Ethnic separatism implies that there is a local, ethnically defined community that wishes to separate from a larger state with which it holds little in common. The assumption behind the term is that activism has a local origin and is to a degree representative of all members of the ethnic community. The adversary of ethnic separatists is the larger state, like Russia and the Soviet Union, which can be seen in a semi-colonial light, and not the community at large, or the international community. In the early 2000s, the Chinese state began using the terms Islamic terrorism and religious extremism alongside ethnic separatism. Compared to ethnic separatism, terrorism is a much simpler accusation and a more powerful diplomatic tool. Terrorism signifies a small group of extremists acting against the interests of both state and local community. Rather than being representative of local opinions, terrorists may be manipulated by international groups and may pose a threat to both immediate and international communities. Okay. So, I can skip a slide. So prior to the 9/11 attacks, China was notably silent about ethnic separatism with international audiences. In the 90s, China was still seen as an emerging economic power, still establishing crucial relations with other states, and it was not certain that the West, which was celebrating the breakup of the Soviet Union and establishment of free states across Central Asia, would not support the establishment of an independent state for Uyghurs. The September 11th attacks in the U.S. provided China with the vocabulary it needed to assert and justify further control over the region. When George W. Bush announced that the Islamic terrorists were behind the attacks, attacks and fanned belief in a worldwide web of Islamic terrorism, China was quick to jump in and declare that it, too, had long been struggling against international Islamic terrorist networks within Xinjiang. Just 2 months after the 9/11 attacks, the Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister declared at the UN that terrorist forces of East Turkestan are trained, equipped, and financed by international terrorist organizations. In January of 2002, the Chinese State Council published a report stressing supposed links between al-Qaeda and the Uyghur opposition, grouping the two under a single label. In fact, there was no unified Uyghur opposition, and it certainly wasn't tied to radical Islam or funded by the al-Qaeda. Existing opposition was primarily local, small-scale, existing on a spectrum between peaceful student protests like those in Gulja in 1997 and the extremely marginal East Turkestan Islamic movement. Chinese authorities focused on the ETIM, or East Turkestan Islamic Movement, claiming extensive connections with al-Qaeda and imminent invasion from al-Qaeda-trained ETIM terrorist forces in Afghanistan. The leader of the ETIM, Hassan Massoum, assured Radio Free Asia that his ultimate aim was the liberation of Xinjiang, and he denied any organic link with al-Qaeda. Numerous experts, including I think Sean Roberts, have pointed to a credibility gap concerning attacks attributed to the ETIM, as the Chinese state often controls all access to and reports of the attacks. Some Uyghur experts have publicly doubted the existence of such an organization, claiming that no one had heard of the group before it was blacklisted. And others believe that ETIM to be part of a U.S.-China quid pro quo, where China supported the U.S.-led war on terror and support of the U.S. for the condemnation of ETIM was connected to that support. By August of 2002, however, China had persuaded the U.S. government and the UN Security Council to include the ETIM on the list of groups linked to al-Qaeda. This potential threat from a marginal group of uncertain existence proved extremely useful to a Chinese state seeking firmer control over its northwesternmost region. Ironically, China collaborated with the Taliban to extradite Chinese national Uyghurs who had taken refuge in Afghanistan. As China, it should be noted, has not taken a historically consistent stance on Islamic extremism. During the Soviet-Afghan War, China actually trained Afghan Mujahideen, which are Islamic freedom fighters, and the proto-Taliban, some who later became al-Qaeda, in southern Xinjiang, providing them with weapons and training. It was China's support for what became the Taliban that introduced radical Islamic ideas into Xinjiang's predominantly Sufi-leaning Uyghur populations in the south in the first place. By the mid-2000s, Wang Lichuan had instilled the idea that Uyghur and Han were fundamentally different peoples, that one was capable of terrorism, the Uyghurs, while the other was not, that one needed protection from dangerous members of its own group and international conspiracies, while the other was both an innocent bystander and the only party capable of preventing their troublesome ethnic minority co-nationals from extremist tendencies. Also, I should note the photo here, so a number of Uyghurs were actually detained, I think 22, in Guantanamo Bay for up to 9 years, and then they were just released because, and the ETM was later taken off of terrorist lists because no one could find proof. All right. So, in the spring of 2009, several hundred underemployed Uyghur youth from the far west of Xinjiang were sent somewhat involuntarily to work in a factory in an industrial city in China's far southeast. So this is the equivalent of going from, say, Seattle to Miami. Negative stereotypes about the Uyghurs and miscommunication resulted in male Uyghur workers being attacked by their Han counterparts. Hundreds were injured and 2 died. The state tried to hush up the news, and Uyghurs back in Xinjiang were infuriated over the lack of prosecution and honest inquiry into the case. On July 5th of 2009, predominantly Uyghur citizens began peacefully protesting on the streets, demanding a more thorough inquiry and justice for the attacked factory workers. The government sent out riot police and tanks, and the protests soon turned violent, with some Uyghur vigilantes attacking Chinese that they saw on the street. The state claims that ETIM was also involved. There was a swift crackdown, and over 1,000 people were arrested or disappeared within the first few days. 2 days later, on July 7th, there was large-scale armed demonstrations by ethnic Han males in Urumqi, intent on extracting revenge on the Uyghurs, as you can see in the two photos stacked here. Right. The police reportedly stood by, even sometimes joining in the attacks, and hundreds were killed or injured, but few were ever arrested. Immediately after the dual riots, the state clamped down on communications and transportation, cutting off calls outside the province and shutting down the internet for the entire province for an entire year until things calmed down. In line with the rhetoric that they had adopted after 9/11, the state, of course, claimed that religious extremists and the ETAM terrorists were behind the July 5th attacks. In 2010, the internet was turned back on and the state embarked on a campaign promoting ethnic harmony. There was relative calm from 2010 to 2013, and the state emphasized that ethnic harmony was possible. However, ethnic harmony came at a high cost for the Uyghurs. The state projected itself as protecting the majority of peaceful Uyghurs from an extremist minority bent on harming Uyghurs and Chinese alike. These extremists were again painted as both political and religious extremists. Wang Liqian stated that the riots were not a homegrown problem and did not hint at an inter-ethnic conflict within the region, but were part of a massive conspiracy to sabotage ethnic unity. The deputy governor of Xinjiang dismissed accusations its policies were connected to unrest, saying that armed Uyghur groups have links to Central Asian and Pakistani Islamic militants, saying those minorities of people, the violent terrorists, ethnic splitists, and religious extremists who want to cause trouble, their organizations are all outside the country, as are their backers behind the scenes. How could we let this minority of people split Xinjiang off from the rest of the country and destroy this peaceful and harmonious society? It's impossible. To protect Uyghur and Han alike from extremist elements, a number of stringent controls were put in place. Uyghurs were told what they could wear versus what was terrorist appeal. In one ironic example of image piracy, which China is famous for, a poster proclaiming a ban on Islamist beards actually used a paparazzi snapped photo of an unshaved Keanu Reeves, as you can see in the corner here. So this isn't from an actual, right, I don't know if I can put it out. Anyway.
We made it bigger.
You made it bigger, so you can all see that Keanu Reeves is banned in China? Okay. Right, so they were also told where and when they could pray, what books they could buy, and what they could study in school. Members of the Communist Party, state employees, and public school students are, by law, atheist. Anyone under the age of 18 cannot have a religion in China and cannot be instructed in religion. But this law had previously been interpreted loosely, and Muslim cadres and university students alike had attended Friday prayers and fasted during Ramadan for decades. However, after 2010, mosques were required to install security systems and homeroom teachers were required to watch weekly recordings of Friday prayers and out any student caught participating in prayer. So I had a number of friends in Urumqi who told me they simply couldn't go to Friday prayers anymore because if they did, their homeroom teacher would be required to watch these on Sunday evening or Monday morning, and if they were seen on camera, they would immediately be expelled from the school that they had worked years to gain entrance to. The year that Wang Liqian retired in 2012, Xi Jinping assumed power as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and paramount leader. By 2013, he had himself declared president for life. Xi's rise to power should be read within the context of the return of hardline politics and strongmen politicians the world over. In 2012 to 2013, I also happened to be teaching at a public university in Xinjiang. When I arrived, inter-ethnic tensions and mutual distrust between Uyghurs and the state was palpable. In early 2013, a series of attacks rippled across the region, and security measures became far more stringent. For example, at the university that I taught at, students pretty much had to go through airport security every time they went through the university gate. So they would have to write down, only ethnic minority students, their name, their ID, like their government-issued ID number, where they were going, who they would meet, what they would do there, how long they would stay, and when they would return. Okay. I was also attacked by university security. I guess they were kind of security one day going through the gates because I was riding my bicycle and I wasn't supposed to be riding my bicycle in the car lane, and they assumed that I was a Uyghur student, so they actually apprehended me, threw my bicycle to the ground, and punched me. So that was great. So that was not great. Luckily, I was an American, and I got them, they had to go through retraining, but they did not get fired. So these kind of security measures and suspicion of everyday activities started amping up right around 2013. So again, whenever there was an attack or whenever we heard about an attack, the state immediately blamed the attacks on well-organized, internationally funded Islamic extremist political groups. Again, this was impossible to independently confirm. For example, there was an attack that happened, I think it was in March, and by the time that we heard about it, there were rumors about it flying everywhere. But by the time that international reporters were allowed within 60 kilometers of this little oasis village, 2 months had passed. All traces of the attack were cleaned up, and locals explicitly begged not to be interviewed about the event. Within Urumqi, surveillance, especially for minority students, was ramped up. Everyday actions came under the state's eye, and previously small infringements like attending Friday prayers or praying on one's own during the day or fasting during Ramadan were met with increasingly harsh reprisals. In many instances, school officials actually forced students to come to school and to eat during the day during Ramadan because it was illegal for them to fast. The official line was that there were more dangerous terrorists threatening society as a whole, including moderate Uyghurs, and that these measures were necessary to apprehend future terrorist attacks. The state was merely intervening to protect the peaceful majority from a violent minority, a minority that was as much of a threat to fellow Uyghurs as it was to the Chinese state. At the same time, officials reassured the public in mainland China that the majority of Uyghurs were good people. Too busy singing, this is from an actual statement, too busy singing, dancing, and being good hosts to plot terrorist attacks. Public promotion of cultural and environmental tourism in Xinjiang actually increased in this period. Then, in May of 2014, Xi Jinping launched a Strike Hard Against Violent Terrorism campaign to eradicate ideological viruses. In the name of combating violent Islamic terrorism, the CCP introduced strict measures governing religious practice, education, language use, encouraging people to use Chinese, which the officials could understand, movement, dress, and association. For example, it has long been illegal in China to indoctrinate youth in religion. Essentially, it is illegal to teach or read the Quran or the Bible or any other religious text to children or in their presence, and illegal to have anyone under the age of 18 participate in a religious practice in a religious institution. This law was not always observed, but in the past 10 years, the state has strictly enforced the law, punishing parents both for sending their kid to the local equivalent of a Sunday school or for even reading the Quran at home, as this could theoretically cultivate extremism. Certain modes of dress were also seen as potentially extremist. Most women in Xinjiang haven't historically used a full head covering, although they will cover their hair with a scarf because Xinjiang surrounds a desert and it's quite sandy. But all types of headscarves, including the ones that protect your hair from the sand, were banned, as were beards, including Keanu Reeves. At the same time, unannounced to the public, to counter this terrorist threat, starting in 2014, the state began building what it termed vocational education centers, and what others call detention facilities, prisons, forced labor camps, and concentration camps. The camps were not known internationally until 2008. The state claims that it was ensuring regional stability and protecting people from extremism by re-educating individuals who have shown, or could possibly show, like Keanu, extremist tendencies, and ensuring that people have both Chinese language and relevant vocational skills. From people who have escaped these camps, we know that these do not usually resemble the idyllic re-education centers that foreign journalists are occasionally allowed to tour. People can be detained for any number of reasons, from voicing less than complete support of the party to having relatives studying abroad, and the centers are constructed and run, as you can see, like maximum security prisons. Critics say that many of those interned did not need to be re-educated. They both spoke fluent Chinese and were respected professionals. At this point, possibly 2 to 3 million Uyghurs, the majority of them young or middle-aged males, have disappeared into these camps. This is 20 to 30% of the Uyghur population and a majority of able-bodied adult males. Uyghur human rights groups claim that these camps are prisons and forced labor camps that target innocent people and are part of an ultimate goal of cultural genocide. So in 2015, China passed a largely controversial anti-terrorism law that allowed the country to both participate in international counterterrorism efforts and conduct more intensive spying on its own citizens. So China was actually using Europe to create its own terrorist laws at this time. In 2006, while I was actually working at the think tank, the Chinese state began grooming international audiences for discovery of the internment camps or re-education facilities in Xinjiang. Following an ISIS-facilitated bombing in Brussels that left 32 dead and 300 injured in, I think it was March 2016, China used the attack to draw a parallel between ISIS and Uyghur terrorists. So I actually wrote an op-ed about this in March of 2016, saying that following a predictable pattern, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has used the recent attacks in Brussels to support its own strong-handed tactics. While state representatives officially gave their condolences and declared that they stood behind Belgium in the wake of Tuesday's attacks, the state newspaper Global Times used the tragedy to claim that security was a weak link in Europe, which, though modern, is still very fragile in the face of terrorism. Chinese state media outlets have suggested that Europe was ill-prepared to deal with the attacks. And they said the same thing about the Charlie Hebdo incident in France. So the Global Times further claimed that the whole of Europe seems to be turning into a place where terrorism is raging, and predicted a coming chaotic clash of civilizations between the French Catholics and the French Muslims, and Belgian Muslims as well. For its own part, through the government mouthpiece china.org.cn, China has claimed that it firmly opposes terrorism in all forms and is willing to enhance cooperation with Belgium and the international community to jointly face the threats and challenges posed by terrorism to safeguard world peace and stability. It seems that China was using Europe's tragedy to cast its own military buildup in a positive light. China was positioning itself as a source of security, aid, and contrasting China's relative stability with European states' supposed inability to counter terrorism. Propaganda within China and crafted by the Chinese government for audiences abroad, like this 2020 documentary called Tianshan Still Standing, Memories of Fighting Terrorism in Xinjiang, cast the current conflict as a struggle between security forces taking necessary measures to ensure basic stability and security against a small group of radical religious extremists bent on destroying society. As stated by the police officer in this frame, some people may criticize us for use of excessive force. Well, we're also fighting against the leaders of violent terrorism, religious extremism. Our measures against these mastermind criminals are severe, but legal. The focus of security teams is on counter-terrorism. If this poison is allowed to continue, our country will be finished. We want our children to grow up in a sunny future with long-term security and social stability. All people who live here yearn in their hearts for a life of harmony and stability. These videos and internal news items rarely mention the camps. Average Chinese citizens, like I had 2 students last year who are from Beijing, they often have no idea that the state has locked up millions of people, most for the crime of potential for ideological derivation. And they genuinely believe the state line that only those who pose a danger to society have been imprisoned, that Islamism is a potential threat that must be controlled, and that control measures are for the benefit of society and are always justified. In short, the state has successfully convinced the majority of its own population that most Uyghurs are happy within the Chinese state, and rather than a majority of Uyghurs yearning for greater religious, political, and personal freedoms, it is actually the case that a minority of extremists is threatening to jeopardize the security of all. When it does discuss the camps or vocational education centers, The state claims that it is training undereducated and underemployed minorities in valuable trade skills in order to lower poverty levels and boost long-term regional stability. After praising a vocational program that has placed one young woman in a bakery, a public security officer in the documentary is quoted as saying about Xinjiang youth, "They're young and not well educated. They have no direction in life, no goals, no real jobs. They can hardly tell right from wrong." After the camps were discovered in 2017, the foreign press was notably less sanguine about the state line. Uyghur academics in the U.S., including my Uyghur teacher who is at Indiana University and is now, I think he's now at Radio Free Asia, they have reported that their family members were being detained on account of their political and academic activity abroad. Just being in the States was enough to put their family members under suspicion. In China, party members, local officials, state news producers, bakers, businessmen, school teachers, models, and university students alike have disappeared into the camps, suddenly cutting off communication with family and friends. Many of those detained have been well-educated, successful professionals, moderate in political and religious views. Few foreigners have been allowed inside the camps. Those who were report highly orchestrated visits, as seen on this 10-minute BBC clip, which you can easily find on YouTube. To foreign reporters and governments, the Chinese state claims that they are using the camps to reform people potentially posing danger to Uyghur and Chinese society at large. Relatives of those interned, persons who have been released, including a number of citizens and permanent residents of other states, mostly Kazakhstan, and even disillusioned former employees of the camps, have testified that even small deviations or tangential affiliations, like having a nephew studying in the U.S., could land one in the camps. Some areas have reportedly been given quotas that they need to fulfill and have taken people in almost arbitrarily. To monitor civilians, the state uses an extensive surveillance system, including physical cameras and checkpoints, spyware and cell phones, Chinese big brothers placed inside Uyghur homes, and an extensive network of local informants, including among the diaspora communities in Egypt and Turkey. There is literally no space that is not under state gaze. All of this produces a system where there is, in practice, very little freedom of movement, speech, or association. The state still supports freedom of religion, but only in officially prescribed spaces and in officially approved manners. Many people who have left Xinjiang note that they were not comfortable going to Friday prayers or engaging in other religious observance because this could get them detained, and at the same time the Chinese state has been deconstructing historic mosques around the region. However, at the same time, Uyghurs also recall having state officials request that they appear at the mosque for prayer when camera crews and foreign journalists were scheduled to tour. Religious practice is permitted thus only when it is part of an officially orchestrated performance. Nevertheless, the state claims that Xinjiang is now more secure and has amped up marketing Xinjiang as a tourist destination, particularly to residents of inner China. Just as in the 1950s, albeit in a much more invasive manner, the state has separated out religion into institutions, which are a potential source of subversion and thus must come under state control, and religious practice, which has been placed in the realm of secularized local ethnic culture. Apparently, according to China Daily, tourism trumps terrorism. So, going back to our original question, when states claim to protect religious freedom, what does this mean? Which sphere of religious activity is free? And how large is that sphere? Is it freedom of association, of belief and pursuit of knowledge, of practice, of celebration, of institutions, of structuring society? And is this freedom positively defined? Is it the freedom to act, to believe, to say, to do? Or is it a freedom within a clearly delineated sphere, or a freedom under state gaze? And perhaps most importantly, are freedom and stability mutually exclusive? Does curtailing individual freedom, including autonomy over religious belief, religious practice, and religious association, or going back to the case in France, freedom of religious education, actually result in greater societal stability? So going back to the exercise I introduced at the beginning of the lecture, we know the state's rhetoric, but what intentions lie behind it? What does it really imply when these policies are implemented? Right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariane. Can you hear the applause? That's what we always say. It's kind of it's our line. We've been saying it now for almost a year, but it was excellent, and I'll give you my applause.
Yeah.
There are so many themes, obviously, that are linked up between these talks already, and I'm sure we're going to see more of these tomorrow. I could sit here and talk to you for a half an hour about this, but we want to get to some questions. Starting with one of our good friends, board member Paul Connick asked, did Uyghur imams traditionally have authority in civil matters? Was there a separation of civil and religious matters, or was Uyghur society largely theocratic?
This is a very complicated question. I could talk about this for an hour, and he probably wouldn't appreciate that. So before 1911, you have the Qing Empire, which is a Mongolic empire. Scholars now say it was an inter-Asian empire, and they kind of ruled Xinjiang semi-indirectly, but differently in different places. So within Xinjiang, there were Qing-affiliated local notables who were generally not religious officials, landed people who had contact with the government. And then there were also local imams who were less connected with the Qing government, but they did have, for example, jurisdiction over local courts, and they did run a lot of the local schools. And in the early 1900s, things got a bit chaotic, but there was actually a movement called Jadidism, which is very hard to say, that came out of Russia through Uzbekistan into Xinjiang, and it was kind of this Islamic modernism, and they started running a lot of schools in Xinjiang as well. So you had mostly Islamic schools in Xinjiang before 1949. Some of those were traditional, and then some of those were run by the modernists, who also taught other subjects like history and geography and math. So kind of a mix.
And very interesting. I have Joanna is definitely asked a question that I see so much of this in France as well. Joanna writes, I'm struck by the logic you referenced about, quote, liberating Uyghur women, end quote. It just sounds so familiar to logic we've heard here in the U.S. to justify interventions in the Middle East. Can you speak a little bit more about this? Why did this kind of rhetoric resonate in the PRC at the time of initial state intervention into Xinjiang? I'll say it just mirrors very much the discourse of sort of a French center feminist discourse about the veil in liberating Muslim women. So how does this fit in the Chinese context?
It's quite complicated, actually. I actually wrote my entire master's thesis on this. But I don't want to answer you in 60 pages. I don't think you'd appreciate that either. Basically, when China came to power, it really struck on the theme of liberation of women, even though the CCP was majority male. And you had a lot of women, like women running the All China Women's Federation, complaining about sexual harassment and the glass ceiling in the 1950s in China. But the CCP was still really big on liberation of women. Women did actually receive a lot of rights when the PRC was formed. They weren't always observed, but for example, divorce became very easy. Women were expected to work and expected to earn a not quite equal salary, but a salary. Women were expected to go to education and become professionals. So when they came into Xinjiang, all of this had been happening in inner China. And in inner China, Gail Hirschadder and Wang Zheng have done really great work on this. In inner China, it is posited as liberation of women from feudal Chinese society. In Xinjiang, a lot of this is pushed forward by Chinese women from the interior. So in the interior in China, we have this rhetoric of liberation of Chinese women from Chinese feudalism. In Xinjiang, it becomes liberation of Uyghur women from Uyghur society under the helping hand of Chinese women. So when in the articles on Xinjiang, people don't talk about feudalism in inner China. They don't talk about oppressed Chinese women or Chinese women being forced into marriages at the age of 12 or 13. They talk only about Uyghur women as if it's particular to that place.
Thank you for that answer. We have No, there we go. I have Tim Hall. I just want to announce this. Tim, I don't know if you're aware of this. We have wonderful Carolina K-12 databases of resources and lesson plans, and I asked my colleague, Paul Bonici, who works directly on that, if we have one of these. Tim Hall asks, are there any resources that you can point to in which to incorporate this important global challenge into the classroom, specifically world history and AP world history? And my answer to that is, if you don't have the answer, we're going to figure out a way to get it into our databases.
Yeah, I actually did a talk for public educators affiliated with the Carolina Asia Center, and the name of that is escaping me right now, but I did create a worksheet, and I can get that.
Okay, fantastic. Well, certainly, if that's something, Ariane, if you're willing to share with Carolina Public Humanities, that's something we would be interested in sharing through Carolina K-12. And Tim, we certainly hope that you will go to Carolina K-12 for a lot of our various resources. Lloyd Kramer, who you know, and we all know, hello Lloyd, asks, is the attack on Uyghurs motivated by religious distrust or a desire to control resources in Northwest China? And how has the repression affected Chinese relations with predominantly Muslim countries? Has the spirit of Bandung completely disappeared? And is Muslim-Chinese international distrust now pervasive?
Okay, I think I need those questions like one at a time.
Okay, let's start with the first one about is this religious distrust or desire to control resources?
Yeah. China has other Muslims. So China has had Muslims. I mean, there have been Muslims living in what is now China for over 1,000 years. Generally, relations have been peaceful. So even the other half of China's Muslims are Dungan or Hui. They are starting to complain about religious crackdowns now, too. So there is a religious element to that, we think. At the same time, Xinjiang has a lot of natural resources. And I do think it is more a case of the state attempting to secure the region and this extreme distrust of any sort of potential identity formation outside of state control. I used to live in Guangzhou, where most people historically spoke Cantonese, and there was also kind of pervasive, this is like 2011, pervasive crackdown on Cantonese education, Cantonese language publications, or any forms of Cantonese culture that were not inclusive of Chinese culture.
Yeah.
So this is not just unique to Xinjiang, but it takes off. I mean, no one in Guangzhou is being sent to a forced labor camp.
A little softer touch in Guangzhou.
Little softer touch. It's just their newspapers being banned.
So, and the second part of Lloyd's question was about the broader relations with Muslim countries. Has this repression affected Chinese relations with predominantly Muslim countries? Has the spirit of Bandung completely disappeared? And is Muslim-Chinese international distrust now pervasive?
Okay. So, Bandung was great in 1955. The problem was that a lot of these newly independent nations couldn't agree on a lot of stuff. So the second Bandung Conference that was supposed to happen in 1965 actually never happened. So we don't actually see this greater inter-Asian African solidarity lasting for decades. There are some manifestations of it, not as much as people hoped in 1955. More recently, this is a very complicated question because there are a lot of geopolitics involved, and China is a huge economic and political player. I can talk more specifically about Turkey because I also know Turkey pretty well. In Turkey, the Chinese state has been pressuring Turkish officials to kind of keep their eye on and even sometimes arrest members of the Uyghur diaspora or deny them residence permits. And even though Turkey has common Turkic ancestry, and Turkey, of course, has an Islamist leader right now in Erdogan, China is still a huge power. Like, you don't cross China just because you happen to be Muslim.
And certainly China's development initiatives in the last few years are really exerting that financial influence throughout the world.
You also don't cross China when China is giving you billions of dollars in aid.
That's always a good rule of hand here. We're getting very close to the end. I do see some. Joanna Smith has a question. Actually, I'm gonna, if Joanna doesn't mind, because she'll be here tomorrow, I'm going to go to Jerry Everhart's question and ask: is the U.S. or any other question doing Radio Free Europe type programs into the Uyghur areas of China? If so, what is the content of these programs?
So there is actually a really great Radio Free Asia that has a Uyghur service. Actually, I've known a few people who've worked on that. They do phenomenal work and really great reporting. I do not know if it is the state of that being broadcast into Xinjiang at this time, because it is so hard for people to get in now, and because the Chinese state has developed a really extensive security frame. I am doubting that that is getting into Xinjiang right now, and I am betting that if you were listening to it in Xinjiang, the spyware installed on your phone would immediately alert the state. So most people are hearing it more in Central Asia, like in Kazakhstan, where a lot of Uyghur refugees are residing right now.
Well, thank you for that. We've hit the end. I'm going to let just see a quick response to Tim Hall saying, what are your thoughts on the reporting in Frontline China Undercover? Have you seen this?
I have.
You can watch it tonight and give a report tomorrow. No,
Okay.
no, but that does sound like an interesting program. Sorry, Tim, we don't have any thoughts on that right now. But I'm not sorry for being here tonight because we've learned so much. I want to thank you, Ariana. This has been so fantastic. We look forward to joining you in the panel tomorrow. I want to remind everybody, so let's one more time put our hands together, folks, out there in the ether. Yes, we felt it. It was like a butterfly's wing coming past my ear, the clapping. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely edifying. I have a bunch of questions to ask tomorrow, and hopefully we can get into some of these topics in our panel session. Tomorrow we'll be joined with our dear friend Lloyd Kramer, who will be moderating and hosting, and Joanna Smith will give a wonderful talk on religious freedom in America, and then we'll have our panel session. Folks, thank you for joining us. Go to bed tonight feeling religiously free. And come back tomorrow and we'll have a wonderful continuation of this discussion. We'll see you soon. Thank you very much.